Call Phil Twyford.
Mr Chair, it's often said that the perfect should not be the enemy of the good, meaning that if something's good enough, it's good enough. But in this case, sir, that is not the case with this bill. This is a case of the inadequate, the mediocre and the unsatisfactory being the enemy of the good. We voted for this, sir. We voted for this bill at first reading because we thought that to establish a strong, central, independent environmental regulator would have been a big step forward for New Zealand. But disappointingly, the bill that has emerged from Select Committee and come back to the House is really a pale shadow of what it could and should have been. We listened carefully to submitters at the Select Committee, and there were four key problems, concerns that emerged from that process. The first is that the functions of the Environmental Protection Authority are far too narrow for this new organisation to exercise any real kind of leadership in the environment sector. The objectives are adequate. It doesn't even include the task, the responsibility of protecting the environment, bizarrely. Third, that the EPA is not sufficiently independent from the Minister. Its independence is compromised. And that in the question of its need to take into account Māori perspectives in its decision-making, the legislation is confusing and in fact sets back the environmental legislation in this regard. I first want just to talk about the functions of the EPA and point to, sir, a couple of supplementary order papers that are on the table in the name of Charles Chauvel. One of them would insert a new paragraph, Part 2, Clause 12, Paragraph C, that would charge the EPA with carrying out the administration of the Waste Minimisation Act 2008. And so my colleague has brought this SOP to the House because we believe that the administration of the Waste Management Act is one of the functions that it was always obvious that the EPA should be responsible for. It makes complete sense, it's logical, and we're at a loss, sir, to understand why this has been excluded from the objectives of the EPA. Similarly, we are baffled as to why the climate change legislation, why the various functions of the Resource Management Act haven't been handed over to the EPA. There's a second supplementary order paper in the name of Charles Chauvel, Part 2, Clause 12. This one is a new paragraph E that would give the EPA the responsibility to protect and enhance the coastal and marine environment and to carry out the environmental management of New Zealand's exclusive economic zone. This is, of course, an issue that's on the minds of everybody in New Zealand at the moment because of the deep sea offshore drilling that Petrobras are doing off the east coast of the North Island. It's a matter of great concern to all New Zealanders that drilling should be properly regulated and that our marine environment should be protected for generations to come. We have no confidence that that kind of protection is in place, and we are mystified as to why the EPA hasn't been given the responsibility to discharge those tasks. It's interesting, we've noticed a bit of a trend with some of the legislation that's coming through the Local Government and Environment Select Committee, and there's something about this bill, sir. It's unformed, it's partially formed, it's just not all there, and it really should never have been brought to the House by the Minister at this time. He should have waited until more of the groundwork had been done, until there was a more substantial, more comprehensive and more developed bill for the EPA, and so we've seen that in the building, Mr. Chair.
Called Phil Twyford.
We've seen that with the building amendment bill that's currently before the Local Government and Environment Select Committee. We've seen it with the Weathertight Homes Financial Assistance Package, which has a deferred commencement date because the government's still negotiating with the banks who are supposed to be providing the finance for that. And we've seen it in as I said, with the building amendment bill, where a number of reforms are being proposed for the building and construction industry, and yet people in the industry have come to us saying, look, the cart's been put before the horse, the industry's not ready for it, these things aren't being sequenced properly. So there's a bit of a pattern emerging of inadequate, undeveloped, poorly thought through legislation being brought to this House, and you can only surmise, sir, that it's because of the electoral cycle that ministers, not just this minister but others, are keen to be seen tabling some bill, trying to get some run on the board before the election at the end of this year. Well, we question, sir, whether in fact the EPA being established by this bill is of sufficiently credible and substantial that it will survive. There are real questions about its long-term viability because of the inadequacy of the structure and the mandate and the roles that are being put in place here. A number of powers and responsibilities are being transferred from existing bodies, but it's really happening in a piecemeal fashion. And a number of submitters pointed out that the legal situation in regard to the EPA and its relationship with other key bits of legislation, the Hazardous Substances legislation, Resource Management Act, the Climate Change legislation, all of these bits of law now have to be read in conjunction with the EPA and vice versa. And that will have the effect of making our environmental law more complicated and less accessible and less intelligible to the lay person. A related concern that we have, sir, is that the bill gives the minister the power to direct the EPA to carry out additional functions. And the minister has assured the House that such functions are likely to be minor and ancillary to the current functions of the EPA. But we remain concerned, sir, that this is an unsatisfactory way of setting up the kind of future development of the EPA. There is no bright line test to determine whether something is an ancillary or a substantive function. It's up to the minister of the day. He will make a political judgment, and that, sir, could undermine, not only confuse the public, but could undermine the integrity of the EPA if that is the way it's going to grow and develop over time. The second big concern, sir, that we have is that as I mentioned, the objectives in Part 2 here do not even include explicit granting or tasking of the Environmental Protection Authority with the job of protecting the environment. And it brings to mind George W. Bush's Clean Skies legislation in the United States, which perversely actually substantially degraded the quality of regulation of air quality in the US, and to call this bill an Environmental Protection Authority raises real questions about truth in advertising, sir. It is not really an Environmental Protection Authority, and when you look at the objectives, that becomes even more clear. Charles Chauvel has tabled a supplementary order paper, Part 2, Clause 11, inserting a new paragraph C that would rectify this defect in the bill by explicitly stating that the job of the EPA would be to protect, maintain and enhance New Zealand's environment. I mean, it's pretty basic stuff, sir, but it's a mystery to us why that's not in the bill as we see it.
I call Louise Upston.